Chapter 16. Unauthorized Snooping. Friday morning I dropped off a head of lettuce and a bunch of asparagus at Lily's office. "How's the grading coming?" I asked as Rochester walked around her office, sniffing the art books on a low shelf next to her window. Her office was a large, well-lit room in Harrow Hall, the fine arts building, and the walls were hung with student drawings, paintings, and charcoal sketches. She had her auburn curls pulled up to the top of her head in a Pebbles ponytail, and she wore a t-shirt from an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. "Only a dozen portfolios left to look over," she said. "You have it easy in the English department, you know. Papers are so simple. You can email them, print them, carry them around if you need. Try grading a refrigerator-size oil painting sometime." "Rochester, stop sniffing," I said. "You're not an art critic." He came over to me, and I rubbed behind his ears. "Think you'll be free for dinner tonight?" She shook her head. "Sunday. Brunch?" "It's a date." I leaned down and kissed her. "I'll let you get back to your appliances." Rochester and I left Harrow Hall and walked up the hill toward Fields Hall, past the library. I looked at my watch. Nothing much on my agenda, so I had time for some more sleuthing. I took Rochester back to my office, closed the door, and put up a note that I was in a meeting. Then I returned to the library and found my way back to that same secluded carrel where I'd been the day before. I turned the computer off, then on again, hitting the same key sequence so I could disengage freezer burn. Then I let my fingers do some walking. One of the things I learned during my years as a tech writer and web developer was that often computer people get so cocky they ignore basic safeguards. I found a list of all the techs who worked for Very M. Partial and played around with breaking into their email accounts. And, what do you know, her assistant director, Oscar LaVista, used 1234 as his password. It's like he was almost begging me to break in and read his email. Once again, my adrenaline was racing and my fingers tingled. But then my hacking instincts kicked in. It seemed almost ludicrous that he'd make it so easy. Perhaps he was setting up a honeypot, a trap to detect hackers. We'd had one of those where I worked, a false entry into the website with some decoy files. I opened the computer's task manager and made sure no security-oriented programs had opened and were writing anything to remote directories. While I gave the system a minute to be certain nothing was going to kick in, I looked around. The other computers were occupied by students, and I was conspicuously older than they were. What would I say if someone I knew came by and spotted me? Of course, I'd say that my office computer was acting up and I was waiting for tech support. Given all the problems we'd been having with freezer burn, anyone on the college staff would believe me. When I was pretty sure no alarms had been triggered, I opened Oscar's email account. It didn't look like a decoy. I had access to hundreds of emails he had sent and received. I shook my head. Not only was his security shoddy, his mail folders were poorly organized. I was trained to manage my inbox. Every time I dealt with a message, I either deleted it or placed it in a relevant folder for archiving. But Oscar didn't believe in that. He had a mix of opened and unopened messages in his inbox. He didn't even bother to delete those campus-wide spam messages we get about toner cartridges, union votes, and farewell parties for staffers most people didn't even know. Was he incompetent, though, or just overworked? As I read through the messages he had sent, I saw that he understood the issues involving not only freezer burn, but the other software and hardware he dealt with. The timestamps on his messages indicated he was often responding to questions late at night. He had clearly tried to communicate to Very the problems that the techs were having with freezer burn, and every time she shut him down. I wondered if he'd be a good informant. Perhaps he'd be willing to go on record about problems in a way that dust and debris couldn't afford to. I couldn't get into Very's account. She was smart enough to use a complicated password that was hack-proof, at least without the advanced tools I had hidden away at home. I looked up Oscar's profile on the campus intranet. He was a moon-faced guy with dark hair and a mole on his chin. I didn't think I'd ever seen him. He held an associate's degree as a computer tech specialist from Broward College in Florida and had been with Eastern for 2 years. Should I suggest that Jim Shelton or Dot Snice talk to him about the problems with freezer burn? Or approach him myself? I pushed away from the computer, stood up and stretched. "Hey, Prof, what are you doing over here?" Once again, my adrenaline zoomed. I looked behind me and saw Lucy Goosey holding hands with Desiree in front of a display of illuminated manuscripts from the college's collection. I didn't even need the excuse I'd prepared. A simple lie came right to my tongue. I just needed to use a computer for a couple of minutes, and I didn't want to go all the way back to my office. How you doing, Lou? 2 final exams and I'm done, he said. And I heard from Penn State. I got accepted into their Masters of English Ed program. Congratulations. How about you, Desiree? You graduating this term? If I can. My degree audit's all screwed up, and the lines at the registrar's office are out of control. Desi's moving to State College, too, Lou said. She's getting her master's in environmental science. Cool. Well, good luck to you both. I gave them a brief wave and left the library, relieved that no one had caught me with Oscar La Vista's email account on my screen. When I walked back to my office, Rochester hopped up from his space by the French doors. But instead of coming over to greet me, he jumped up on the low table by the window and posed there, his head up. He looked at me as if I was supposed to understand what he was doing. But I was baffled. He held his right paw up to me, as if he wanted to shake. I took it and said, "Yes, pleased to meet you." As soon as I let his paw go, he jumped down and ran in a couple of circles around me. "I get it," I said. "You're practicing for the next dog show." I motioned him back up to the table, and he jumped up. Then I held out my hand the way I'd seen Rick do, counting down the 5 seconds. And when I'd finished, Rochester jumped down. I laughed, gave him a treat, and sat down at my computer, only to discover that the entire college's email system was down. I experienced a momentary pang of guilt, worrying that I had done something to trigger the catastrophe. But that wasn't possible. All I'd done was disable freezer burn on a single computer. It was a pleasure to be able to get some work done without the constant interruption of incoming messages, though. I had a boss once who called it being in the zone, when you got so wrapped up in your work that you were most efficient and didn't even notice time passing. I spent the morning finishing all the press releases on the student award winners, and then wrote a quick program to search through the databases for alumni who lived near a winner and also had given us an email address. When email access was restored just before noon, I sent the press releases out in small batches to avoid getting caught in some alum's spam detector. I'd made myself a big salad that morning, using fresh lettuce from Hugo First's farm stand, and I sat back at my desk and thought about Rita Gaines as I ate. Her killer must have brought the Rohypnol to her farm, but had he or she known about the cobra venom, or found it once Rita had been knocked out? Rochester wasn't happy with my vegetarian lunch. He'd eat the occasional chunk of carrot or zucchini slice, but for the most part he was a carnivore. He had to be happy with a couple of treats from my desk. Either way, it seemed, the killer had to be someone who was familiar with Rita's farm. I remembered Rick saying that he had a list of the people who had trained their dogs with Rita, as well as those who had bought dogs from her, and I called him. "How you doing with that list of dog people?" I asked. "Haven't even looked at it," Rick said. "There was a break-in at the Crossing Florist last night. Somebody stole about 100 expensive orchids. I've been swamped with that. Turns out the florist is best friends with the mayor's wife." "You want me to look at the list for you?" He groaned. "Steve." "Hey, we're going to that dog show tomorrow. You should be prepared in case we run into anyone who might be a suspect." "I really hate you. You know that?" "Oh, come on. You know you don't mean that. Just send me the list. You know you want to." "If I didn't have this other case that the chief was hot for..." I know. I'll do some quick research for you, just to help you focus." "Fine. I'm emailing you the list now. See you tomorrow morning. I'll call you if I find anything before then." The email popped into my inbox a minute later, with 3 Excel spreadsheets attached. I saved them all into my jump drive and then opened the first one up. It covered the casual clients who, like Rick, brought their dogs up to Rita's occasionally for help with agility training. I was interested to note that Rick had been paying Rita $20 a week for her help in preparing Rascal. I opened the other 2 spreadsheets. One included a worksheet for every dog Rita had sold for the last 5 years, including the dog's parentage, current owners, and any medals won at dog shows. The other was similar, but these were dogs Rita trained for both obedience and agility. The sheer number of people was overwhelming, and I started to think that Rick had played me the way Tom Sawyer did when he got his friends to paint that fence for him. I decided to begin with Rita's training clients because I'd seen the way she behaved, and it was easy to imagine her pissing someone off. There were a dozen embedded worksheets, 1 dog per sheet. 8 were current clients, and 4 were people who had trained with Rita in the past. I opened up the worksheet for the first of the ones who were no longer Rita's clients. The sheet for a dachshund named Lady's Luscious Lover, aka Lush, indicated he was nowhere near a champion. He had been entered in 8 shows and only won a 3rd-place ribbon once. Rita's notes were scathing. Lush's owner, a woman named Paula Madden, was unable to control him. The dog was slow, lazy, and a disgrace to his pedigree. And those were the G-rated comments. I was surprised that Rita would use words like easy and brain dead to describe Paula. I wondered if she had said those things out loud, too. I did a quick search on Paula Madden and discovered she owned a shoe store at the Oxford Valley Mall. When I pulled up one of her online ads, I saw that little Lush figured prominently. He was photographed resting his head on a pair of pumps, sniffing high heels, and with one paw delicately placed in a jeweled sandal. The rhinestones on his collar matched the ones on the shoe's straps. Okay, another crazy dog lover. I couldn't throw stones, though. The big goofy golden dog snoozing on the floor next to me was proof of that. The next sheet was curiously brief. Baby Blue Eyes had a similar pedigree, but had never entered a show. There was a brief note at the bottom of the page which read, "Deaf, offered replacement, but idiot refused." The owner's name was Sal Piedramonte. His address was on Samarkand Court in Stewart's Crossing, and I recognized it as one of the short cul-de-sacs in River Bend, at the other end of the neighborhood from my townhouse. I lived on Sarajevo Court, which ran into Minsk Lane. The complex had been built by emigres from the former Soviet Union who had brought a bit of home to Stewart's Crossing. My 2-bedroom townhouse with an attached garage was a Latvia, and there were models for Serbia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Croatia. The largest was the Montenegro, which I'd heard one of my neighbors call the Mount Negro. I tried to remember if Rochester and I ever met a deaf dachshund on our walks, but little dogs barked aggressively at Rochester, so we usually walked quickly past them. Nothing jumped out at me about the dog on the next sheet, Puffball, other than that he had only one name, and I couldn't find out anything about his owner, Pippin Forrest. Puffball had entered a few shows, but Pippin's handling was sloppy, and according to Rita's notes, the dog hadn't meddled. The last owner to have left training with Rita was Mark Figueroa, and I knew him. He was an antique dealer in Stewart's Crossing, and he often stopped in at Gale's Cafe for coffee when I was there. He was an avid reader, and we talked about mystery novels and travel memoirs sometimes. I didn't realize he had a dog. Rochester turned on his side and scratched his toenails against the wooden floor. "Rochester, no!" I didn't want to end up getting stuck with a bill for refinishing the floors. His feathery tail thumped against the floor, but he didn't lift his head. "What's up, boy? You need to go out?" He jumped up as if he'd stuck his paw in an electric socket and began dancing around. I wanted to open the French doors and let him out into the garden, but I knew he couldn't be trusted. He'd tackle some sandwich-eating student, intercept someone's frisbee, or terrorize the squirrels. Of course, because I had a lot on my plate, Rochester was maddeningly slow about doing his business. By the time I got back to the office, there were a slew of new email messages waiting for me, and I had to put aside sleuthing to work at the job that paid my bills. I kept hoping I could come up with some way to delegate some of the work to Rochester, because there had to be some way to channel all his intelligence and energy. Instead, I did all the work myself, and he slept. Before I closed my computer down for the day, I printed out all the worksheets Rick had sent me so I could study them at home the next morning. As usual, though, Rochester had other ideas. Chapter 17. Defective Merchandise. I meant to make myself a quick dinner and then sit down with those printouts, but Rochester was antsy, even after our regular walk and his bowl of food. He kept rocketing around the living room, and the only thing I could do was take him for a long walk and use the opportunity to check out my newly discovered neighbor, Sal Piedramonte. It was still early evening, the sky a violet blue as we circled through the Eastern European-named streets of River Bend. We walked slowly, heading toward the other end of the neighborhood. I wasn't sure where Samarkand Court was, but I had a general idea, and after continuing past the big lake at the center of the community, we approached it. I noted Sal Piedramonte's house, the same model as my own, and continued walking. When we turned the corner onto Vilna Vista, we stumbled into the middle of a doggy playdate. A dachshund and a shih tzu rolled around together in the grass. A golden we knew named Hopi dashed around them. Hopi's dad, a white-haired retiree named Dave, motioned us to join in. I let my dog off his leash, and he went chasing after Hopi, and I walked up to Dave. He introduced me to the 20-something dark-haired guy with him. "This is Sal. That's his Doxy Blue. The Shih Tzu's my son's. I'm taking care of him while they're on vacation." "I've never seen a dachshund with a white ear before," I said to Sal, happy to run into the guy I'd been looking for. "Gives her character." "There's a reason for that," he said. "One white ear plus blue eyes are markers for a congenital deafness." I remembered the note on Rita's spreadsheet. "She can't hear at all?" He shook his head. "The first couple of months I had her, I thought she was just stubborn, the way she ignored all my commands and couldn't be housebroken. Finally, one day a friend of mine was over and he figured out she wasn't stubborn. She was deaf." "Wow, you didn't know that when you got her?" "The breeder should have known, but she pretended she didn't." The big dogs continued to run in circles around us, but Blue and the Shih Tzu came over and sprawled on the ground at our feet. "I went back to her and complained, and you know what she said?" I shook my head. "She said she didn't sell defective merchandise, so she would take Blue back and put her to sleep and give me a choice of another dog." "That's harsh," I said. "I'd never consider a dog merchandise." "Me either. I told her what she could do with her merchandise, and I walked out." "This was a local breeder?" I said, playing along. He nodded. "Her name is Rita Gaines. Stay away from her." Dave agreed. "I've heard bad things about that woman, and not just from Sal." "Rita Gaines," I said. "Isn't that the name of the woman who was killed last week?" "Really? You mean somebody beat me to it?" Sal said. "Good job, whoever did." "Now, Sal, you shouldn't say things like that," Dave said. "Why not? She was a bitch, and I'm glad she's dead." He leaned down and picked up Blue, cuddling the dachshund in his arms, and I could see how bright blue her eyes were. "How is it, having a deaf dog?" I asked. "I mean, you can't call her or scold her or anything, can you?" "We have a series of hand signals. Once I made sure she was always looking at me when I wanted her to do something, we started to get along fine." He raised the dog up and kissed her on the snout. "Isn't that true, baby Blue?" Rochester hopped up and put his paws on my groin. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, and then we said goodbye to Dave and Sal and their dogs. Walking home, I wondered if Sal had been faking his surprise at Rita's death. Could he have killed her? What if he'd gone back to her to complain about something and she'd made disparaging comments about his baby? Could he have gotten so angry that he'd have killed her? He was a young guy. He probably knew, or at least a bit, about roofies and the effect they had. He could have slipped the roofie into her iced tea, then injected her with the cobra venom. I shook my head. Rita hadn't been killed in the heat of an angry passion. Someone had thought the crime through carefully, noting the cobra venom at the barn and then figuring out how to inject Rita with it. That didn't sound like a guy who was pissed off because his dog had been called defective. Darkness fell quickly as we walked back home, and by the time we got there, Rochester was worn out, and I'd spent too much time thinking about Rita Gaines without any result. I tabled those thoughts and turned to my laptop. I logged into the online course management software Eastern used and navigated to the Dropbox where my tech writing students had submitted their final research papers. Most of the students were decent writers, and we'd done enough exercises through the term that they had their research and citations pretty close to correct. I marked them on a couple of other criteria, including an appropriate and correctly sized picture or photograph, using a table to lay out the picture and the accompanying text, using different fonts as appropriate for headers and captions. I looked up from grading the last paper to see Rochester over by the coffee table where I had piled the printouts of Rita's customers. He had his nose up to them, and as I watched, he reared up and used his paw to swipe them to the ground. "Rochester!" I yelped, jumping up. "Don't do that!" He was pushing the papers around with his nose by the time I got over there. He had an unfortunate taste for paper, and I was worried that the next morning I'd be pulling the ropey, barely digested pulp out of his butt, not something I particularly enjoyed. I remembered I had carried the sheets home in my briefcase, where I often had a couple of dog treats as well. Had the smell of the treats attached themselves to the pages? He was sniffing at one sheet in particular as I leaned down and cleaned them up. I snatched it out from under his paws and saw it was one for Mark Figueroa, my antique dealer friend, and his dog, Judy's last song, a Chihuahua. Doing a bit of quick cross-referencing, I saw that Judy and Carissa's dog, Tijuana, had been littermates, but Mark had only attended a few training sessions with Rita before dropping out. Did he have some kind of grudge against Rita? Perhaps she had criticized his dog too. Mark and Gail from the Chocolate Ear were close friends, and I could ask her about him. But her cafe had closed by then, and Mark's antique store in downtown Stewart's Crossing would be closed too. I picked up all the spreadsheets and put them on top of a counter Rochester couldn't reach, then went back to my laptop to finish grading the last paper. Then I exported the gradebook to another Excel spreadsheet, where I calculated the semester totals. The last step was to enter them into the college mainframe, but since there were a couple of students who might still submit their work late, I decided to wait. It was a lot of trouble to change a grade once it was in the mainframe. After I shut down the laptop, I dug around on the kitchen counter until I could find Rochester's brush. "Come here, puppy," I called, and sat down on the tile floor. "We have to make you handsome for the show tomorrow." He scampered over and put his head in my lap. I started brushing his coat, pulling out strands of soft golden hair. "I could make a sweater out of you," I said as the hair piled up. He kept trying to go under the kitchen table, leaving me only his back end to brush, then turning around on me. By the time I was finished, there was hair everywhere, and I had to get the vacuum cleaner out to pick it all up. Rochester clambered upstairs and hid from the noise under my bed. When I came upstairs myself, he came out and jumped up on the bed to watch TV with me. As I scanned through the channels with one hand and scratched behind Rochester's ears with the other, I felt very righteous about completing my grades, since they weren't even due for a few more days. That freed me up for investigating over the weekend with Rick. I thought about entering them into the college's mainframe computer, but that's always more of a pain to do from home than from school, even without the interference of freezer burn, so I thought I'd wait until Monday. Chapter 18. Showtime. Saturday morning, Rick picked Rochester and me up in his truck, and we drove up Route 611 through Doylestown and Quakertown to get to Bethlehem. Dogwoods were blooming in pink and white, and maples were rich with green buds. We passed at least 3 spring cleaning yard sales, rickety card tables piled with chipped dishes, out-of-date textbooks, and other useless junk its owners hoped would put a few bucks in their pockets. We parked in front of the college's technology center, in view of a series of white tents where the show was being held. Around us were dozens of cars, trucks, and RVs, and almost everyone sported some sort of dog bumper sticker, from "My Labrador Retriever is smarter than your honor student," to "It's the Golden Rule, Golden's Rule," to "Proud parent of a Bichon Frise." "Dog people," Rick said, shaking his head. "And what are we? You spoil Rascal more than I do Rochester." "Don't remind me." From the parking lot, we heard the loudspeaker announcing the walkthrough for the standard class for novices. "Shit, that's us," Rick said. "We've got to hustle." "What do you mean? Are you competing?" Rick tugged Rascal's leash and hurried forward. "It's Rascal's first time," he said over his shoulder. I shook my head and followed with Rochester. He had already prepaid his admission and Rascal's entry fee, so we sailed past the elderly woman at the registration table. By the time I paid our admission and picked up a program, then walked into the broad lawn where the tents had been set up, Rick and Rascal were already in line next to one of the rings. Ring seemed the wrong word, even though that's the way they were labeled. It was more like a rectangle, with all the equipment set up inside. I'd seen all the stuff at Rita's, but somehow it looked more impressive under the sprawling white canvas tent, with dozens of dogs around. As I watched, a woman led her whippet up a ramp, across a flat plank, then down. Ahead of her, a borzoi was climbing the A-frame, while a sheltie was on the teeter-totter. I checked out the program. The events were divided into 4 classes by height. Rascal was in the 3rd category. The loudspeakers competed with the barking of dogs and the whir of portable fans that cooled the area. I couldn't see how the dogs could concentrate on what they were supposed to do. I kept Rochester on a short leash by my side, and sometimes I had to hold him back if he wanted to sniff another dog or take off in search of Rascal. We skirted the main performance ring and walked between 2 rows of vendor tables. Fortunately, most of the merchandise on display was for little dogs. Pink plastic carriers with mesh windows, rhinestone collars, and tiny leather jackets with upturned cuffs. Or I'd have ended up buying Rochester something I'd regret later, like a pair of felt moose antlers or a big rubber clown nose. I did like the harnesses at one booth, and if Rochester didn't already have a couple of beds, I'd have been tempted to buy him another from a vendor with a wide variety of beds, cushions, and dog blankets. There was even a booth selling clothes for the humans accompanying their dogs around the course. All around us were dogs on platforms being groomed, dogs practicing their jumps, dogs on leather leashes and plastic cords. The biggest seemed to be the giant Schnauzer, and there were a couple of teacup Chihuahuas that I could hold in the palm of my hand. I spotted Carissa, the elegant Latina who had trained her dogs at Rita's. She wore a pair of cream-colored pedal pushers and a sleek V-necked athletic shirt made of some kind of expensive microfiber. It clung to her in all the right places, and it was decorated with tiny rhinestones which matched the ones on the collar worn by her Chihuahua, Tia Juana. I introduced myself to Carissa.
"Oh, Rita," she said. "How terrible! When I heard the news, I was so upset. So was Tia. Sadly, in my country, we are too familiar with violent death."
That was interesting. How did she know Rita had been murdered? As far as I knew, the papers had only reported her death, not the crime behind it. Did you know Rita well?
"I bought Tia from her and she convinced me to start training her. I wouldn't say I was her friend, but I've been investing with her for years."
Rochester leaned down to sniff Tia Juana. "She didn't seem like the type to make friends," I said.
"Well, you won't find many people here who liked her," Carissa said.
"Really? Why not?"
"She was a fierce competitor, and she had no self-control when it came to telling people what she thought of them and their dogs, as if she was the only reputable breeder around."
That must have made a lot of people angry. Carissa nodded toward a 40-something Asian man in pressed khaki slacks and a military-style shirt festooned with pockets and epaulets. As I watched, he pulled a treat out of one of those pockets and fed it to the fluffy white Bichon he had on a bright blue leash. The dog's haircut made his face look round as a dinner plate.
"That's Jerry Fujimoto," Carissa said. "He raises Bichons and trains them for his owners. Rita was always bad-mouthing him and his methods. I heard he lost a number of clients because of it."
"But she didn't raise Bichons herself, did she?"
"No, only Doxies and Chihuahuas. But she definitely had her own way of doing things, and if you didn't agree with her, she let you have it."
Tia Juana yelped as Rochester's nose got too invasive, and I jerked back on his leash. "Sorry, he still has a lot of puppy in him." She looked at her diamond Rolex and said,
"We need to get ready anyway. I want Tia to get some practice at the long jumps."
"She does long jumps? But her legs are so tiny."
"They adjust the distance for the size of the dog," she said. "And you'd be surprised at what my Tia can do."
They trotted off, Tia Juana leading the way, and Rochester and I meandered toward Jerry Fujimoto. He was a whirlwind of activity, chatting up owners and dogs alike, and I knew I'd never get a word in with him as long as the show was on. As I stood there, a boy of about 8 with a Bichon on a jeweled red leash said,
"Can I pet your dog?"
"Sure. Rochester, sit." The boy tentatively placed his palm in front of Rochester's mouth so he could sniff, then patted him on the head. The boy's hair was a golden red, similar to Rochester's, and he was missing his 2 front teeth.
"Is your dog competing?" he asked.
"Today we're watching. How about you?"
"We already did. Puffball came in second in his height class."
Puffball. What a name for a boy dog, I thought. Then I remembered that name from the list of Rita's ex-clients. "I'm Steve," I said, sticking my hand out to him. "Do you train with Mr. Fujimoto?" He shook my hand limply and nodded.
My name is Pippin, but people call me Pip.
From the Broadway show or The Lord of the Rings? I asked. Puffball was completely disinterested in Rochester, instead straining toward another Bichon, probably a female.
I'm a hobbit. Yeah, my parents are big geeks. My sister's name is Mary Adoc.
I laughed. I guess Puffball wasn't too bad then, and that explained why I hadn't been able to find anything about Pippin Forrest online. He's a nice guy, Mr. Fujimoto?
Not really. He yells at the dogs a lot and scares me sometimes. But we used to train with this other lady named Mrs. Rita, and she was even meaner. When my dad said we were switching, she called him a really bad word. At the last show, Mr. Jerry and Mrs. Rita were yelling at each other. He told her he hoped she died and went straight to a bad place. I'm not supposed to say out loud.
Interesting. But did Fujimoto mean that enough to kill her? I couldn't ask Pip that question, but it rolled around in my head. Pip petted Rochester some more and said,
Your dog is really sweet. I wanted a big dog, but my parents said no.
I leaned down to his level. I'll tell you a secret, I said. It's not the size of the dog's body that matters, but the size of his heart, and I'll bet Puffball has a really big heart. Hearing his name, the dog turned around and returned to Pip's side, sprawling on his back and waving his little legs in the air. Pip stroked his stomach and said, Yeah, he's a good boy. I heard the announcement of Rick's class and said goodbye to Pip and Puffball. Rochester and I found a place along the side of the ring. I stood, and Rochester sat beside me as if he was observing and taking notes. It was quite comical to watch the owners scurrying alongside, waving their hands, whistling and making clicking noises as if it was an event for sufferers of some obscure mental syndrome. Some of the dogs ran right through the course like pros. Others were more tentative, and a couple disregarded some of the obstacles. That's a weave fault, the announcer said as a border collie entered the weave poles from the wrong side. He called a refusal when the Sheltie stopped short in front of the tire and wouldn't jump through it, and a time fault when a Vizsla took too long to complete the course. Finally, it was Rick and Rascal's turn. I couldn't help snickering as Rick, normally the tough cop, babied Rascal up the A-frame, through the tunnel, then over the jump. He ran next to the dog like a crazy person, and I thought I'd get a lot of teasing out of it. Though Rick looked nervous, Rascal performed like a champ, and he ended the event in third place, winning a yellow ribbon for his trouble. The four of us strolled past the vendors again.
Late yesterday, I heard about a woman who wasn't on the spreadsheet, Rick said. Cora Straw. Apparently she left her dog with Rita when she went on vacation, and when she came back, the dog was dead.
I stopped in front of a display of walking sticks with dog heads. That's terrible. What happened?
Rita gave some story about the dog having a heart attack on the course, but she had already disposed of the body before Cora came home.
That would drive me crazy, I said. Oh, look at the golden retriever bookends. A pair of resin dogs, looking a lot like Rochester, sat on their haunches with their backs against imitation books. And those yardsticks with little dogs on them.
Step away from the display,
he said in his most stern voice.
I'm doing this for your own good.
I cast a glance back at the kitchen towels and the garden flags as Rick grabbed my arm and moved me along. We bought some rubber toys and rawhide chews for the dogs, then headed back toward the parking lot. When I checked in, I picked up a list of all the breeders who were showing, I said, pulling the paper out of my pocket. I thought maybe you could call them and ask about Rita.
You forget who's the detective around here,
Rick said, pulling an identical list from his pocket.
I do have a few skills, you know.
Yeah. Rascal and Rochester jumped eagerly into the back of the truck, then sprawled out next to each other and went right to sleep. Remember that list you emailed me yesterday? I asked Rick as we pulled out of the campus. The people who trained with Rita? While you were competing, I met one of the ones who dropped her today.
Which one?
Pippin Forrest, but he's only a kid. I think we can knock him off the list because I doubt an 8-year-old can get his hands on Rohypnol.
Parents?
What do you mean? Does he have parents? I guess so.
And one of them could have been pissed off at the way little Pippin was treated, right? After all, we're going on the assumption that someone didn't like the way Rita handled a dog.
A kid just ups the ante. I didn't get that vibe from Pip, I said. He said that Mrs. Rita yelled a lot, but it seemed like he accepted that from adults. He did say he's training with a new guy named Jerry Fujimoto, who Carissa told me had a beef with Rita. Didn't everyone? Rick said. He handed me his copy of the trainer's list. Make a note on the sheet for me, will you? I did. I didn't see any of the other 3 people who stopped training with Rita, but we both know one of them, Mark Figueroa, from the antique store in the center of town. Rick said. How about the others? Just did a quick search. Paula Madden owns a shoe store at the mall. I thought I'd get Lily to go over there with me and scope it out. And Sal Piedramonte lives in River Bend. Rochester and I met him and his dachshund last night. He was pretty angry about the way Rita dissed his dog when she found out Blue was deaf. Wanted to give him a different one and put Blue to sleep. That seems pretty hard, Rick said. I mean, being deaf isn't something fatal. He said Rita treated her dogs like merchandise. It's an attitude, but is it a motive? Hey, as you pointed out earlier, you're the detective. So you do listen to me sometimes. Asshole, I said. He laughed. Lily's finishing up grading her students' projects, I said, as Rick drove up to the River Bend guardhouse. You doing anything for dinner? Got a date, he said. Loser. He waved to the young female guard on duty, who smiled and opened the gate for him. He dropped Rochester and me off at my house, and I thought about driving into town to look for Mark Figueroa, but he probably had a date too. I microwaved a frozen dinner and poured Rochester a bowl of kibble. When he finished, I gave him one of the new rawhide chews and he settled down with it, his back against the sliding glass door. While I ate, I grumbled about having a girlfriend and still being home on a Saturday night, but then Rochester came over to me and slumped next to my feet. Then we watched a movie together. I thought it was pretty stupid, but Rochester seemed to like it. Sunday morning, Rochester woke me when the sun was just peeking over the rooftops across the street, and we went for a long walk. A bluebird darted between the fronds of the weeping willow at the end of Sarajevo Court, and all around us were signs of nature waking up. I was looking forward to spending the day with Lily. We'd been talking about going downriver to the flea market in Lambertville, and I thought it was a perfect day for that kind of aimless browsing. But she called me around 10 and asked if we could change plans.
This guy I used to work with called me last night, she said. He's hot on a story and he needs some background from me. He asked if I could meet him for brunch.
Background for a story? Of what? Art?
All he would say is that it involves Eastern, and I'm the only person he knew with any connections to the college.
It's not like you need an in. He can call the public relations office, or hell, he could call me.
Good. So you'll go up to Summit with me to meet him?
Summit? Where's that?
Ritzy suburb of Newark. About an hour, I think.
Isn't that an oxymoron, a ritzy suburb of Newark?
Since you're heading up north, you can drive up here to get me, and then we'll go in your car.
She hung up. Chapter 19. Peter Pan. I shook my head. How had I let myself get roped into spending my Sunday with my girlfriend and some guy she used to work with? What if he was still interested in her and using this as an excuse to get together? And what kind of story was he writing about Eastern? I rushed through a shower, got dressed, and pacified Rochester with a hard rubber squid he'd already torn one tentacle from. As I pulled into Lily's driveway, she stepped out the door, locking it behind her. She wore what I had come to see was her standard casual outfit: skinny jeans, a man's button-down shirt, and bright red high-topped sneakers that matched the rectangular frames on her eyeglasses. She had a couple of cameras on straps over her shoulder. Her auburn hair cascaded in waves down to her shoulders and smelled great as she hopped into the car next to me. She leaned over and kissed me, then carefully slid the cameras onto the back floor of the car.
Thanks for doing this. I have no idea what Van wants, but it sounded very hush-hush. If there's something strange going on at Eastern, I thought you'd want to know about it and figure out the PR implications.
How well do you know this guy? I asked as I backed down her driveway.
We worked a couple of stories together when we were both freelancing.
She leaned back in the seat, stretching her legs.
Our biggest was an expose for the New York Times about child soldiers in Nicaragua.
That was a bad story. He still works for the Times? She shook her head.
The Wall Street Journal.
What would the Journal want with Eastern?
Beats me. How was your day at the dog show yesterday?
I noted the quick shift away from Van, whoever he was, but I went with it. I told her about watching Rick and Rascal compete as we drove downriver to Yardley. We picked up I-95 at the Scudder's Fall Bridge.
You know these roads pretty well,
Lily said as I exited 95 at New Brunswick, where I picked up US 1. My dad grew up in Newark and had family up there, I said. So we used to go up this way a lot when I was a kid, but most of the people from his generation are gone, and I lost touch with the few who are left.
Really? That's sad.
My dad was an only child, so most of those people were his cousins. I can't say I was that close to any of their kids.
I wish I lived closer to my family,
Lily said.
When I was looking for a job, I tried to get something near my brother and his kids in California, but nothing came through. I have a few cousins scattered around the country, but the closest to here is one in New Hampshire.
We turned east on I-78 just beyond Newark Airport, and Lily called her friend's cell to get directions to the diner where we were meeting him.
He says to stay on 78 to 24, then take the Morris Avenue exit. The Peter Pan Diner is right there.
Got it. We pulled up in front of the diner a few minutes later. A rangy blonde guy in jeans and a fisherman's shirt was leaning on a BMW convertible and talking on a cell phone, and Lily hopped out of the car and ran up to him. I followed her, watching as they embraced.
This is Van Driver, she said, presenting him to me. My boyfriend, Steve Leviton.
At least she made our relationship clear. That was a plus.
I didn't realize you were bringing someone,
he said, and I wondered if bringing really meant dating.
Steve handles PR at Eastern, Lily said. I thought he'd be more help to you than I could. What's this about, Van? Why all the cloak and dagger? I'll tell you inside.
He let us in, and we sat at a peeling vinyl booth in the front window. The place looked like it had been around since Jesus wore short pants, with a vinyl tile floor, Formica tabletops, and a small jukebox at each table. Around us, teenagers in polo shirts with popped collars ate burgers and fries and joked around.
What's good here?
Lily asked Van, picking up the menu.
No idea. Never been here, but I had an interview this morning in Summit and the guy recommended the place.
After the waitress took our order, Van said,
The story I'm looking into is about a woman with connections to your college. Started out as a regular obit, but I've been turning up some strange things.
Who's obit? I asked. Not Rita Gaines. He turned to me.
You knew her?
Steve's an amateur detective, Lily said dryly.
His friend is the policeman investigating the murder, and he's been trying to help out.
I winced. Ouch! Trying?
He's been helping, Lily said. Better?
Better. Are you looking into her murder? I asked Van. He pushed a blonde curl off his forehead. His face was tanned and lined, even though he probably wasn't much older than Lily or me. And yet, he still had a boyish enthusiasm which came through when he talked.
In a way, there's something funky going on with her investment business.
The waitress delivered our platters, and I had to wait till she was finished to ask. Funky? How? Anything that might bounce back and hurt Eastern?
I'm not willing to say anything right now, just investigating. But I understand she was a member of the board of trustees at Eastern and the college invested some of its capital with her. You know anything about that?
I knew she was on the board, but I didn't know anything about investments, I said.
And I barely knew the woman,
Lily said. Met her at a couple of parties, and then there was the fuss at the exhibition.
What kind of fuss?
Van asked. As we ate, Lily told Van about Fillet's painting and Rita's complaints. Van took a couple of notes, but it was clear from his demeanor that what we had to say didn't matter to his article. Lily finished her eggs and pushed the plate away from her.
Is that all, Van? We drove all the way across New Jersey for this?
Can't blame a guy for trying.
Uh-huh. Well, thanks for brunch.
She scooted next to me with a gentle push. I took the hint and stood, then pulled a card out of my wallet. If you need a formal statement from the college or you want to talk to anyone else there, give me a call, I said, handing him the card.
Will do. Take care of Lily. She's a treasure.
When we were out in the car, I said, You certainly cast your spell on him.
Oh, please. This Peter Pan diner was the perfect place to meet him. He's an overgrown boy. He won't settle down and act like an adult. He just wants to keep chasing stories around the world.
And you outgrew that? She looked over at me.
Yeah, I did. Don't get me wrong. If somebody offered me the chance to go somewhere for a great story, I'd probably jump, so long as it didn't interfere with school or anything else. But I like my life now.
She took my hand and squeezed.
You think we can still make the flea market?
We can try. I backed out of the space and hopped back on the freeway, but I wasn't going to let Lily off the hook too easily. How long did you and he date? She looked out the window.
I told you, we just worked together.
I waited.
We had a fling, all right? When I was married to Philip, the magazine editor, I knew he was cheating on me, and when Van pursued me, I didn't say no. Philip and I were already living separate lives by then anyway.
I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I had never cheated on Mary, and I was pretty sure she had been faithful to me, but I knew enough not to pry into the state of anyone else's marriage. I could only hope that Lily wasn't going to make a habit of cheating.
What do you think he found out about Rita Gaines?
Lily asked as we got onto I-78 to cut back across the state. No idea, but she was definitely a nasty piece of work, so I wouldn't be surprised if she screwed a few people along the way. I regretted that choice of words, but knew if I called attention to the comparison to Lily's relationship to Van, I'd only dig myself in deeper. She probably cheated some of her clients or something.
You think one of them might have killed her?
I shrugged. I'm only helping with the investigation. I don't know the ins and outs. Lily turned to look out the window again. Oops, that was something else I shouldn't have said. The highway sped past us, miles of farmland interspersed with the occasional office building or suburban development. Even though there were almost 9 million people crammed into about 200 square miles of the Garden State, there were still big swaths of farmland in the middle of the state where there was little access to the big cities. Neither of us spoke much. Lily plugged her iPhone into the car's speaker system and played Springsteen tunes, and we both rocked out to Dancin' in the Dark as we sped along. When we finally hit the Delaware, we took the slow road along the river, enjoying the blossoming of nature. We made it to the flea market in Lambertville by mid-afternoon. The sun was shining, and the tall sassafras and oak trees along the edges of the parking lot were budding. Senior citizens, families with kids fresh from Sunday school, and 40-something hipsters like Lily and me were browsing the aisles. Lily got her cameras from the back floor and once again slung them over her shoulder. She stopped periodically as we walked, taking pictures of little kids playing, always with their parents' permission, of course. She also took shots of things I thought were weird: a soda can with flies buzzing around it, a rock with a jagged edge, the leaf of a maple tree with a single drop of water on it.
Think of it like stock photography, she said when I asked her. You know what that is?
Kind of.
I merge the images together sometimes, layer them, fuzz the edges, just play around. I never know what will inspire me.
She found a guy selling used camera equipment and bought a couple of lenses for her lab at the college.
You never know what camera kids will come in with, she said. I like to have a variety of lenses for them to play around with.
It was late afternoon by the time we finished at the flea market, but I knew that the stores at the Oxford Valley Mall would be open until 6. You mind making a brief diversion with me? I asked as I pulled out onto the river road on the Jersey side. I told her about Paula Madden and her shoe store.
I'm not really a shoe gal, as you can probably tell,
she said, pointing to her red sneakers.
But I can fake it if you want.
She leaned back in her seat.
Running around after stories, you realize you need comfortable shoes. It used to kill me when I had to get dressed up and put on heels.
She turned to me.
Does it bother you, meeting a guy I used to date?
I shook my head. We both had lives before we met. All that matters is what's ahead.
We've only known each other a couple of months. There's still a lot for us to learn. But anytime you have a question about my past, you can always ask me.
Me too, I said.
Well, there is one thing.
I looked over at her. Her posture was relaxed, but there was something wary in her eyes. Ask away.
How come you ended up in prison for computer hacking? Isn't that one of those white-collar crimes they slap you on the wrist for?
The question wasn't much of a surprise. I had told Lily only the barest facts about my unfortunate incarceration, not wanting to scare her off. I guessed it was time for the details. I hacked into 3 major credit bureau databases. Those companies are very strict about their security, and it freaked them out that I could get in. So they all got together and made sure I was prosecuted as fully as I could be.
3 credit bureaus? What did you do?
All I wanted to do was make sure Mary couldn't run up more bills on our plastic, I said. I know, I could have called and canceled the cards, but I didn't want her to know what I was doing, and she had a bunch of cards in her own name that I couldn't have done anything with legally, even though I would have been responsible for her debts. I took a deep breath. So I got into her records and lowered her credit limits, then set a couple of flags that would make it tougher for her to get new cards.
How did you do that?
I let go of the steering wheel for a minute and waved my hands as if I was typing. Magic fingers. And luck. I found a back door no one had exploited before. Honestly, they should have thanked me for finding a weakness in their security systems.
But they didn't see it that way.
Nope. But you know how they say, you do the crime, you do the time. I did mine.
And that's when you got divorced?
Mary started the proceedings as soon as I was arrested. She didn't appreciate that I was looking out for her, and frankly, our marriage had been falling apart for a while. The second miscarriage was the end. Lily wrapped her arms around her, and I couldn't help wondering if she had some pregnancy problems in her own past.
You think you would have gotten divorced even if you hadn't been arrested?
I think so, but my head was screwed up then. I mean, those were my kids too, but there isn't the support for fathers that there is for mothers in those situations. Lily was quiet as we drove south, past the stone quarry and the now deserted ski area. I didn't often think of myself as a father. After all, I had no children. Just Rochester. But Mary and I had conceived 2 babies together, even if neither lived to be born. I guess that made me a father in some way.
I had an abortion,
Lily said as we crossed the narrow bridge in Washington's Crossing.
My marriage to Adriana was over, and I knew I had to leave Italy and come back to the States and finish my degree. My period was late, but it was irregular back then, and I didn't think anything of it. Then I got terribly sick on the plane home, and I was nauseous every day for a week.
I didn't say anything, didn't even look over at her. I had no qualms with abortion. I believed it was every woman's right to decide if she wanted to bear a child, and that every child deserved to be born to loving parents. But every time I heard about an unwanted child, I couldn't help but think of the 2 Mary and I had wanted so badly. Lily's voice was quiet.
I had no resources to take care of a child, and I knew Adriano didn't want a baby either. And frankly, I didn't want anything more to do with him. I went to the student health clinic and got a referral to a woman's health center.
She turned to me, and her voice was stronger.
It was the right decision at the time. My mother was dead and my father was remarried and living in Thailand. I was on financial aid and I didn't have anyone else to rely on. I would have had to drop out of school and I had no skills to get a job.
Everyone has to make choices, I said. She took a deep breath.
I dove into my work. My photographs became my children. It wasn't until my marriage to Philip was ending that I woke up and went into therapy.
She smiled.
It's funny how things work out. My students accuse me of being too motherly sometimes. Everything comes around in a circle, you know?
I know. I signaled for the turn into the mall and then reached over and took her hand. Chapter 20. Lush Life. Lily checked her phone and found that Mad About Shoes was next door to Macy's, and I parked over there. You know, for years I wouldn't go in this entrance of the mall, I said as we walked up.
Why not?
A girl I went to high school with was killed in the parking lot here. Really tragic and very mysterious. They never found out who killed her or why.
What happened?
It was early winter, I think, and I remember she had been in the mall buying stuff. Someone shot her, though they didn't steal her wallet or anything she'd bought. Apparently, she dragged herself back through the parking lot until someone found her on the curb. They called an ambulance, but she didn't make it. I keep thinking someday someone will figure it all out.
That's terrible. And that was when you were in high school?
I nodded. Senior year. We had a big class, you know, and a lot of people died. She stopped at the entrance to the department store.
Died? How?
I started ticking them off. One boy had hung himself, and another had shot himself with his father's rifle. A third had been in a car with his girlfriend, stopped at a grade crossing as the train approached. They had argued, and he had jumped out of the car and stood on the tracks. He said he would stay there until she said she was sorry, I said. She didn't say it fast enough.
My God, how awful!
I pushed the door open and continued my list. Another girl had suffered a brain aneurysm at a speech tournament in Pittsburgh. Then there was this girl named Kim, who was one of the first in our group to drive, I said. She liked to pull this trick on people. She'd start to drive away without you, and you had to jump on the car hood to get her to stop and let you in.
That's dangerous.
You bet. Another girl pulled that on Kim, and she slipped off the hood and hit her head on the pavement.
And this was all in Stewart's Crossing?
Lily asked as we walked through the store.
It's so sweet and pleasant.
I shrugged. At the time, we took all that death for granted, though when I got to college and told people I had been a pallbearer at 4 different funerals, they were kind of surprised.
No wonder you have this morbid interest in dead bodies and crime, Lily said. Oh, look, there's the shoe store.
If I hadn't already known that Paula Madden was mad about her little dachshund, I'd have guessed it as I walked up to the store. The window was full of the same kind of pictures I'd seen on her website, only life-sized. Lush was the star of the show, and looking inside I saw the real dog sitting on his tiny haunches next to a woman who was being fitted for what Mary called "do me